Well, welcome to this panel, the first panel, which they've been kind enough to give us essentially the same title as the whole conference, Cybersecurity, Who is in Charge? So I'm Ciaran Martin. The last time I was here, I was at the MCSC. I was head of the NCSC, as Chris said. I'm now teaching, so the pressure is off. If I say anything stupid, it's just embarrassing rather than bringing down the government. We've had quite enough of that in the UK in recent years. In this panel on this really important issue of who's in charge, unlike the moderator's initial remarks on the first session where he said people needed no introduction, I think people do need an introduction here, but not for the reason you might think. It's because I think the job titles listed in your programme do not convey the influence, impact and importance of the people that you've got to talk about this important issue. So I'll invite them up. We have Despina Spanou, Head of Cabinet to Vice President Schinas, who we'll hear from shortly. But again, that doesn't convey her importance over many years as the European Union has gone from almost a bystander in cybersecurity to a major driver of global activity in cybersecurity. We have Andreas Könen, whose job title is Director General for Cyber and Information Security at the Federal Ministry of the Interior and Community in Berlin. But again, that job translates, if you like, into being responsible for the major cyber threats to German national interests and critical infrastructure. And he's also a former vice president of the German Cybersecurity Authority, the excellent BSI. We have Rob Strayer, who is Executive Vice President of policy at the Information Technology Industry Council in Washington, D.C., but a pioneer of US-led cyber diplomacy and a senior, if you like, cyber diplomat under the previous administration in areas such as secure technological supply chains that have translated into policy in the current Biden administration. And finally, Kai Horten, who is a partner at AltoPartners Germany, a leading HR company, but before that, former CEO of one of Germany's most trusted defence partners, a former military person. He's the only one who doesn't face the existential threat, the existential threat of airport disruption, because he's based here in Munich, where he's played a very significant role in this conference. So with that, I will resume my seat. The first question I'm going to pose to Kai, if that's all right, because very often the government people get to speak first, so I thought it might make for a novel change to ask the private sector. So we've got cybersecurity, who is in charge, and in our panel we're accepting that there are different lines of responsibility, but I'm going to give you a chance here, Kai, because you have, on your right, you have one of the most influential policymakers for the European Union, for your own national government, and formerly one of the most influential people in US cyber diplomacy. So what do you want from these people, and what do you not want from them? When we're talking in the private sector about who is in charge, where do you want to be left alone, and where do you need the help of some form of public authority?
Well, when you answering that and talking about the title, as you say, the blurred lines of responsibility, that implies that there are rules and that there is a kind of rule-based order where somebody puts up these rules and somebody has the role of the sheriff who makes sure that everybody plays along these rules. And finally, that there is also a legal system who makes sure that the guys who break these rules go to prison. Well, from what I see in real life, and this is also what we see in global politics these days, this rule-based approach in the world doesn't really work. And therefore, what we at AltoPartners do recommend to our customers, and this is also what we are getting told by many of our clients, is that you should make best use of what state actors are offering, and you should cooperate with what they are offering, but also make sure that by default, your own organization is waterproof and extremely strong and resilient, and that you should build on the triad of people, process, and technology. And it's not by coincidence that I put people here first, because people starting on the boardroom and across the entire organizations need to have the awareness and the mindset and the relevant know-how. They need to be trained and updated, and cybersecurity is team sports, and like in many sports, you better rehearse and train what people need to do across the organization. So this is where I would focus on, cooperate and get the good results there, and then also make sure that you have the right people who have the good level of integrity, not only know-how, but that they really make sure that you can rely on the people you have. This is not totally answering to your question, but it's not only, you cannot rely in these blurred lines on structures, because experience shows that often they would not work.
Extremely useful, thank you. And don't worry, after a career in government and now in a university, I'm used to people not answering questions, but I think you made a better job than many of. So let me turn to Despina. You heard a lot about rules and getting used to where they exist, where they do not exist. You heard about the importance of people. And since I last saw you, pre-pandemic, I mean, the EU's range of initiatives and your legislative accomplishments have been very considerable. Regulation of critical infrastructure through the two NIS directives, General Data Protection, the Cybersecurity Act, IoT regulation, digital operational resilience, the list goes on. So I just wanted to give you the chance, I suppose, to say what's been driving it, where do you see this going next, and how does it fit with what you've heard about where people should be responsible for their own security versus what rules and regulatory atmosphere you might want to be setting at EU level?
Thank you. I hope I can give as long an answer as a question. So
double, please.
Because Peter brought us the timer there. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much. It's really an honor to be amongst all of you. I want to share a secret. I don't know Kai, but I know very well Andreas and Rob. Not because we've had drinks together. Actually, we've never had that. But all this regulatory framework that you mentioned has gone through a big test, because it was not obvious for the EU to regulate all that it has regulated, be that critical infrastructure, be that what we did with our cybersecurity agency certification, the first place of the world that has certification rules. It went through a big test. First, with people like Andreas. Andreas and I have found ourselves in similar panels when we as EU were trying to convince our own member states that the EU had to have common rules on cybersecurity standards. Because what has been driving all this is our notion of having a European Union security system. We didn't depart anymore on cyber, like in the past, from technology security. We departed from the security notion because since 2016, when we had these major terrorist attacks in the EU, our leaders said, we need to move the EU to the security area, something that was not provided in the treaties. So for people like Andreas, this was really not easy to accept. So we had to have a lot of discussions to find the right balance between what the member states can keep, because security is a national issue, and what we need to do as the EU, because our systems are interconnected and the geopolitical challenges are common. And then, once we did that, I was discussing with people like Rob. We've met in Washington in our EU-US dialogues when we're trying to convince the US government that the way to go is regulation, because this way we can collaborate more. And now I just heard Kemba, who said, well, we need to regulate what's not regulated yet. So we've come a long way, and it's very inspirational to see what's going on in the US. So in the EU, what we did is we started first with resilience. So this was the first NIS directive. We said, let's address critical infrastructures. Let's make sure everybody has common rules, put reporting obligations, etc. Prevention, because this is what high standards allow for. So that was the first level. Then we went to the second level. The second level is building more on the lessons learned. What we did with NIS2, so critical infrastructure legislation, is extend the scope. So we went beyond the traditional areas of energy, transport, healthcare, banking, etc., to critical manufacturing sectors. And we did that before the pandemic, so we covered the pharmaceuticals, the medical devices, the food sector. And if you look at what's happening in the world today, thank God we did that. And the other thing we did is to couple that with the protection, the physical protection of our system. So not just the technological part, but also the physical security. So we added legislation. And then we went, the second level also required the security by design. And this is the legislation we have on the table, and this is a future direction, security by design, by which we require all products and services that circulate in the market to meet cybersecurity requirements. Now, that's a first worldwide. Very difficult, I'm sure Andreas will challenge me on this, very difficult for member states. And this is now the third level where we have to work and the future direction, because one of the reasons why member states are resistant and why any government is resistant is we don't have enough people to do all that. So I think the challenge now for the EU and anyone who is in the EU is that, okay, I want to keep the rules. Where will I find the people to implement it? And where will I, as government, find the people to enforce it? Because for every rule, there is a person at the end of the chain, more than one, hopefully. And this is why you will hear later on our Vice President talking about the Cybersecurity Skills Academy, something we are enrolling now and we hope to adopt in the next couple of months. We want to create a system by which we find ways to find the integrity that you mentioned of the people, to find how we can train people, how we can bring more people in. How do you make sure these people are validated by some system that allows you to meet some criteria, etc. So I think the future direction for us is the challenge of implementing what we have put in place. We should have no illusions that this is going to be difficult. And the second is integrating security by design to everything in our society. This goes also to what Kemba said in putting now the onus more on the producers rather than the end users. So everything that comes in the market has to meet security by design. And third direction is finding the people, skilling people, upskilling, reskilling, and making sure you have the force for that. And once you do that, to make sure you have an emergency response, because the war that is going on has shown us more than ever that you need to be ready. And in the EU, it is the first time we have spoken about cyber defense. Member states did not allow us to use the word defense in the EU because it was not a European Union capacity and jurisdiction. But now we decided we need to go ahead with that and bring in defense also in the world of cyber. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I ask a quick follow-up? I promise it's quick. Really interested in what you said about testing regulations. How did you do it and what difference did it make?
What do you mean testing?
When you said when you were developing the regulations, you tested it, tested it with Andreas.
Well, we
what
went
sort of things did you do?
Oh, we consult heavily with our, and the great thing in Europe is that we have different groups that deal with different aspects of cybersecurity. We have operational teams from all the member states, from all the governments, but we also have policymakers. We have the NIS established cooperation group. For everything we do, we need their okay. So we have all the fora necessary to consult the governments, and then for every piece of legislation, as you know, that we put forward, we need to consult industry, we need to have impact assessment. So none of the things we've done has been done just because we thought it was a good idea.
Thank you. I'll bring in Andreas. Now you've been invited to bring some challenge. We've had perspectives from the German private sector, from the EU level. What does concern you, and what do you think the proper role of a big national government like yours is in the blurred lines of responsibility in cybersecurity?
Okay, taking over from Despina, I could just mention the situation that we are now as a federal government, for example, in a sandwich position, at least since NIS2. That's again the case. So what do I mean by that? Actually, we put a strong emphasis in protecting critical infrastructures in the cyberspace in Germany since a long time. We started out, I remember, in 2005 or 2006 with a cooperation with the critical infrastructures on a voluntary basis. And so actually we had a long experience in dealing with critical infrastructures in the cyberspace. And we became aware of the fact that in implementing some common rules, we didn't succeed in any sectors and in any branches. So the final decision was actually actually to come up with regulation and to make them, to push them forward that were too reluctant to enter the cooperative approach. And so actually we came up with the first IT-Sicherheitsgesetz in 2015. And actually it was a winning law by the fact that actually we succeeded in getting all in of the sectors, electricity or water supply or whatever you can imagine, even branches that were very far away from the questions how to deal with digitalization and with the threats coming out of cyberspace entered this approach. And so in some sense, we were a test case in what then happened in the European Union. And the European Union has established since then continuously growing interest in protecting the critical infrastructures. And that's something that joins us today, that brings us together, the Commission as the one setting the common rules for the common market on one hand, but also for the member states and the critical infrastructures we have to deal with and which we have to protect. The implementation is still with the federal government, and it's with the governments of all member states. And so we are playing a very important role now to make it work. And that gets more and important if we look back at the 24th of February last year, when it became clear that not only the cyber arena has to be looked upon, but also still the physical world has to be looked into carefully. But the Commission was already on its way. The CER directive is a very important thing that helped us a lot now in establishing, for example, our own roof law concerning the protection of critical infrastructure. We are now going to find a common approach between the physical world and the protection of the cyber world. And actually, that's something that's taken on by the EU level in giving us a common rules, not only in the sense of a law, but also in standardization of processes, standardization of products, of supply chains, and much more if I look, for example, in the CRA Act that will come up. So, in the end, we have a role that's now even more worth. When I look at the BSI, for example, it gets now not only the chance to interact with the branches like telecommunications on a federal level, but also gets a chance to dive into responsibilities of the federal states to find out how to collaborate with them and to push implementation even further down the line.
That's great, thanks, Andreas. And I might come back to the point that both Despina and Kai raised about people and the constraints they pose. But just in the interest of time, let me bring in Rob for a moment on the overall sort of picture. So when we talk about who's in charge, I mean, to some in Europe, the answer might well be, well, if you sit back and think about it, quite often it's the United States. It's where so much of the corporate production of technology comes from. It's the most powerful government in the world. In a sense, Andreas is talking about perhaps being a sandwich between the EU structures and German business. To torture the metaphor, you know, if the German federal government is the sandwich, is it the US that's making the bread? And how, and you know, to what extent does the US think about this, and how does it think about the impact of its activities, everything from the role of its private sector all the way through to things like the foreign direct product rule in setting global cybersecurity standards? Great
question. I can address that in part from my time when I was working for the State Department, talking to other governments. I'm working with Despina, Andreas, and you on a regular basis to talk about these issues. The United States fully knows that it needs to play a leadership role here in on cybersecurity, on setting norms. I mean, the two most important norms being one country should not disrupt another country's critical infrastructure, and that when there is a cyber threat emanating from one's territory, they need to take action against it. That those norms need to be inculcated into a broader understanding, and if necessary, tools of diplomacy and even stronger tools of deterrence used to get countries to come to abide by those rules. That's been a longstanding U.S. policy, and it continues. On the area that's become the more, I think, interesting evolution over time about technology competition, it's absolutely vital for the United States. They're leading on that, but it's vital that they cooperate with other governments to be successful. There is no regime for export controls or for investment screening that will work or succeed in any longer period of time if it doesn't have multilateral buy-in. There will always be ways for capital and technology to move to other locations that aren't bound by rules if there's not truly a global order with regard to those technologies. I think the other thing that's really important to think about, everyone in this room is well aware of the nature of the internet and that cyber threats are cross-border. As we address those threats from the private sector perspective, it's really important to know that we're only going to address those recognizing the cross-border nature of our supply chains and the way we address markets. There is no company virtually today, certainly the top end, but I even mean down to the venture capital stage company, that is not developing their software globally, not just in one country, not just in Silicon Valley. It's a global enterprise. If they're doing hardware, they're doing hardware in multiple jurisdictions at once. So it's important that as we develop cybersecurity rules, that those are harmonized around the globe so we don't fragment markets. The two things that companies need, they need to be able to scale, to reach multiple markets. They don't want to have to develop different types of technology for each market. There's one country out there that already has 1.3 billion people in their indigenous market, so we shouldn't further fragment Western markets or other addressable markets for the world. And they need certainty about what those regulations will look like in the future. And that's where Andreas has touched on international standards. That's where they become so important, because that really is where private sector companies know it's in their economic interest to develop the best standards on cybersecurity. They're developing those consistently in multiple standards bodies, including the International Standards Organization. They have a joint relationship with the International Electrotechnical Commission called Joint Technical Committee 1. It's a huge mouthful, but that's where a lot of great cyber standards are being developed constantly, including on IoT security. You know, our recommendation on behalf of the tech sector is that as the European Union looks to implement the Cyber Resilience Act, that we are able to look at these international standards so we don't fragment our approach to cybersecurity, and that we really have industry's full buy-in along the way. So that's the other, I think, main point, is that we do all of our cybersecurity with international standards as the basis.
Okay, so you're taking an internationalist approach from a US perspective. Can I just ask a quick follow-up, and then I'd like to bring Despina back in for an EU perspective. Where do you think we are in terms of having the mechanisms for that sort of cooperation to promote that alignment, harmonization? Because it's different from cooperating, say, in operational security. How far do you think we are? Are we in the right place, the wrong place? Are we going in the right direction?
Well, it's no secret that large multinational corporations are involved in these major standards bodies, and they're also involved in ETSI, in one of the 3 European standards organizations. They're also involved in CEN and CENELEC to the extent that they're permitted to do so. That could be a longer dive into standards that we don't want to get into here, but I think that it's happening. And you know, forums for discussion among government leaders are really important to make sure that they're orienting themselves to be able to take advantage of international standards.
May I bring you back in, Despina, at this? How would you characterize the state of EU-US discussions on cybersecurity and, if you like, tech security more generally, in light of what Rob has been saying?
So we haven't established the EU-US dialogue on cybersecurity for some years now, and Rob was leading that for the US side for a while. But because there is no formal cooperation in security, it was very much an exchange of views. And because we had very different approaches with the US, I need to be very frank here, it was not extremely meaningful. We were borrowing ideas maybe from each other, but we were not doing things together. This has changed recently. We saw a big wave of change in the regulatory approach of the US after the pipeline incident, which brought similar measures to the EU ones in the US. And since then, we have seen a real upscale of the EU-US dialogue. The last one took place at the end of last year. And following that, we even made a kind of partnership between the Homeland Security Department and the European Commission, where we work on specific issues. And I think that is extremely promising. Our first partnership was on ransomware following the pipeline incident. Now we have taken it further on exchanging information between CISA and ESA, the European agency and the US agency. And I think that's the way to go. So I think it's very promising, and that despite other politics, we have managed in the last few months to start aligning. So a big change there.
Very encouraging exchange, thank you. Let's switch tack a little bit and go back to the human element. You raised the point about skills and capacity constraints, but I might bring Kai back in. You've heard from multiple different levels of government activity. How does it feel to you as someone who does specialise now in the human dimensions of these problems? How realistic and practical do you think the various innovations have been, and what might you like to see change, if anything?
Well, if I was a bit skeptical in the beginning, I would like first to acknowledge that a huge progress has been made in regulation and legislation, and from that aspect, I think we can be proud. And on the other hand, when, if not now, this progress should have happened. On the sidelines, it still only takes taking out one glass fiber line in order to paralyze a railway system or an airport, which might raise questions on resilience. I think that also underpins then that we still have a long way to go, and it is a marathon. And we see that the need for skilled people is everywhere. From my point of view, too many people still see that only at CISO level and the nerds in the basement who take care of cybersecurity. And I think there everybody should see and understand that this goes all across the pyramid of any organization, be it a government, be it a company. It starts at board level. It must be on the risk screen. The awareness for cyber issues goes from the boardroom through the middle management down to the specialists. And this is on all these levels, hierarchy levels in organizations. You need people who have the right mindset, the right basic training, the right continued training, rehearsal, and this is something which I see in some areas, but there are still too many who see this as a niche knowledge and think that the specialists can make sure that nothing happens, and I think the people are on the false track.
Really interesting, and anybody come in if you want, but I might, if no one jumps in, ask the next question of Andreas, which is, building on those points, you are, if you like, a significant national risk owner. You are responsible for defending and setting the policy for defending national security, cyber equities in Germany. And we've just heard from Kai a bunch of things around what organizations should be doing for themselves. They should be influenced by the atmosphere set by governments, by the rules set by governments, but they have some of their own responsibilities. Really interested in your point of view as someone working at a senior level in a very strategically significant national government. What do you expect people to be doing for themselves and just the government not having to worry about it? And when do you think the national government really will have to step in?
Yeah, actually, I'm expecting a lot from, for example, the companies of the critical infrastructures, because they own the critical infrastructures. They are the ones running it for the people of our member states. And so, actually, they have to deliver their service with digital methods, but with secure digital methods. So everything applies that was already mentioned concerning standardization or security by design, or having skilled people at their sites. That's really important. Where I see the role of, for example, the federal government coming in is actually where it goes towards the cyber security situation in Germany or in Europe or worldwide, we are the ones to deliver a basis for collecting the relevant information and giving relevant information to the critical infrastructures, especially when it comes to questions where it can't be seen by one company or one branch or one sector, where we have to have an overarching picture of the threat landscape, and where we have to give clear-cut advice what could be done to tackle one or the other risk. So that's the most important point. For that, we have to even more enlarge and to push up our cybersecurity response center, for example. But we also have to go further on in cooperating not only between the businesses and the government, but also to collaborate with the federal states government that play an important role in Germany in fighting threats from the beginning.
Thanks very much. And Rob, if there's been one place in the world where, I suppose to date, the answer to who's in charge in cybersecurity has been it's the individual company, it's been the United States, as we've been hearing, reluctance to get into the regulatory space. I suppose, as an analyst of the current situation no longer in government, do you see that changing in the way that we've been discussed already? And do you think that's broadly good or bad thing? And what sort of implications do you think it will have if the federal government starts getting a bit more active in this space?
Yeah, it's certainly true. That is the trend line that we're on. Just last February, just a year ago, we adopted, I think, our first rather strong cybersecurity law, which was a national incident reporting law for critical infrastructure. I think it's really important as these regulations and laws are developed that we keep the end goal in mind, which is we want to see more robust cooperation between the government and the private sector. So as you put burdens on the private sector to report data, you want to make sure that data is something the government can actually use and it's something they can operationalize. Because there's always a cost to the private sector to have to comply with these regulations. There's always a risk as we think about the next regulation that we're chasing the last threat, and a variety of new vectors are being opened up all the time by creative actors in the world. So we need to be careful that we are always adaptive, and that's why I come back again to the international standards, because that's an important way that we can set standards that are adaptable over time. But certainly the United States is on a trend to have more regulation and empowering more of its sector-specific agencies to do more regulation, which, companies are going to comply with that, and they're going to come up with their best practices in these areas. And I think that in the long term can be fine, but it needs to have that really strong collaboration in the private sector.
And what advice would you give to the US government as it develops these regulations about how it interacts with the private sector?
Well, the easiest one is that any of the regulations that are being written really needs to be done in close collaboration with the private sector as they're thinking about what the new measures are. I mean, we're seeing the threats day to day. We've some of the best visibility of what's happening to both our companies when they're, in the case of cybersecurity companies, but also all IT companies, or really all tech companies. And in the world now, every company's a tech company. They're seeing the threat. So it's important that the tool be matched to what their needs are, and any regulation related to it, say in the form of cyber incident reporting, is done in ways that make sense. There's some proposals now that we would have reporting of exploitable vulnerabilities without the remediation already being figured out. And that's going to only cause more problems for companies that create more risk in the global ecosystem.
And I very much want to bring in Despina at this point on the company aspect.
So, on the private sector in the EU, we're not just in the business of putting on obligations and burdens. In fact, we're looking into how to involve more the private sector. We see great difficulty from the private sector in reporting incidents, which is an obligation under the NIS, so we would like to encourage that. And if we learned one lesson from the Russian aggression against Ukraine is the importance of involving the private sector in big situations and in difficult situations. So when we're building, for instance, the Cybersecurity Skills Academy, we're trying to see how to value existing initiatives and existing trainings or whatever exists in the private sector, because we want to bring in the experience of the private sector to the public sector. And another thing we have announced recently in our cyber defense approach is how to bring in the private sector also to help governments in case of emergency response. And that is a first. We need to see how to get it right. But this is about really building in the collaboration.
really struck by that point about it's not all about setting obligations. So we've got just under 9 minutes left, so about 2 minutes per person. I'm scared of yellow and red cards, and also we also can't overrun into Despina's boss's keynote. Just for a sort of closing answer, I'm sorry to start with you, Kai, and we'll work our way along, give the final word to Despina. Given that point about it's not just about imposing obligations and you're at the sharp end of what the obligations might be, what things might you want to see less of? What things might you want to see more of? And what would you like to see done differently in terms of the various actors and what they're doing in cybersecurity rulemaking?
Well, what I would like to see more is speed and efficiency. What I would like to see less is redundancies in structures. If you look at, just take the German example, I'm a big believer in our federal system, but as it was stated by the state minister before, if we have 200 entities on state level in Germany employed in cybersecurity, this assumption might not be wrong that there is also a race for talents within these 200 institutions, which at the end of the day may lead to the result that there are not enough well-skilled specialists within these institutions. So this is something where I think a glimpse of efficiency would help.
Right, and Rob, something less of, something more of, and something done differently, perhaps?
More of is, defining the tools and processes that we want in place between the government and the private sector to be more effective at our end goals. I think less of is go-it-alone strategies by governments that are not consistent with international standards and cause further fragmentation in the global system. That just increases cost. And it's going to take a lot of time to iron those out if they're done in a way that's not symmetrical with other governments who are also willing to come to the table and work together with the private sector on this.
Great. Andreas.
Yeah, what I would like to see more is clearly to define priorities, to overcome especially the problem with the 200 entities. Not all of them have the same responsibilities. Some of them are really necessary for driving cybersecurity forward, but actually the scene is set only by, let's say, maximum 2 handful of players. That's important to have more of this priority set. I want to see less paperware done. Actually, we have to come into implementation issues to have real security working in the infrastructures and not write one strategy or one concept after the other. Clearly, we need those concepts. We have to make sure and clear what our structures look like, but we don't have to put it in the middle of what we are doing. We have to put the security itself in the middle. So, what we have to do differently, exactly those where we have to have the change going to less of paper and more of priority.
Thank you. And last word to you, Despina, on what you'd like to see change and more or less of?
We all want to see less cyber attacks, that's for sure. And I think to do that, we need to do less talk and more operational work in cybersecurity, also as governments. More professionals. The problem of skills that we're advocating, all of us, I think that's very important. And differently, I think we have to do our collaboration differently, be that between public and private sector, but also collaboration across the world between governments.
Well, an awful lot there calls for greater prioritization, for efficiency, and perhaps streamlining some of the proliferation of bodies getting involved in this stuff. I've taken a key theme from the whole of this discussion around, after a period of quite a lot of activity, particularly in Europe, focusing on implementation and getting smart about implementation, and a lot of that relates to gaps in skills. A very interesting set of discussions about making sure that we don't fragment and not having go-it-alone strategies, that we as a group of like-minded countries with similar interests and transnational companies and so forth stick together on all of this. There's a whole bunch of other things that I will have missed, but I will conclude with Kai's request for speed and efficiency by handing back with just under 4 minutes to go with a really great vote of thanks to our excellent panel. Thank you very much.